Hello, everyone. My name is Daryl Kimball. I'm Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, and I welcome everybody to today's special webinar on upholding the CTBT regime in a time of adversity. As with other critical nuclear risk reduction, nonproliferation, and arms control agreements, the 1996 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is under threat due to inattention, diplomatic inaction, and worsening relations between the major nuclear-armed states. As you all have seen in recent weeks, disturbingly, but perhaps not surprisingly, Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a bill from the Russian parliament to withdraw Russia's ratification from the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, ostensibly to mirror the United States' posture towards the treaty, and maybe somehow to pressure the United States Senate to ratify the treaty. Today's event is designed to provide further information and perspectives on the challenges facing the CTBT, which not only come from Russia's recent actions, but from other activities that are going on at the former test sites of Russia, China, and the United States. And today, we're very pleased to have a great lineup of speakers to explore these issues. And we're going to be starting with Dr. Robert Floyd, the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization based in Vienna. He's been the Executive Secretary since August of 2001. He's the fourth ES of the CTBTO since it was established in 1997. And we're pleased to have him with us here today as he and other ambassadors and officials meet for the latest meeting of the Preparatory Commission of the CTBTO there in Vienna. And so Dr. Floyd, if you would please join me. And just before I turn over the floor to Rob, let me also mention that we have, following his remarks and a few questions from our audience, which you can put in through the Q&A function. We're going to have a panel of experts on the topic and practitioners, including Elena Chernyenko, who's joining us from Moscow. She is the head of the international section of the Kommersant newspaper. And we have Tony Jaquez from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, which has been a longtime supporter of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty going back decades. And Tony is one of the leading diplomats on this issue. And so both of them will join me for a panel discussion following Dr. Floyd's remarks and some Q&A. So Dr. Floyd, welcome to this webinar. Again, we thank you for joining us and taking some time out from your busy schedule. So let me turn the floor over to you for your thoughts about recent developments, what it means, and how we move forward to strengthen the CTB regime.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you most particularly Arms Control Association for making this event possible. The commitment of civil society is incredibly important. There is so much that governments can do, there's so much that international organizations can do, but civil society has a really important role of stimulating deeper discussion, working in the education space, and influencing and shaping policies of states. So my deep appreciation to you, Daryl, Arms Control Association, but others that have joined this webinar today, because it really is a joint effort of governments, international organizations, civil society, that actually works towards making this a better place. Your tagline for this event is one that's a little confronting. Russia's move to withdraw its ratification from the 1996 treaty is a reminder that the de facto global test moratorium cannot be taken for granted. I'm not sure that they're the words I would use, but I think it's really good that you've couched it in such a way. But I would like to add to that entry into force of this treaty has never been more important than it is today. And let me explain a little bit about my view on the impact of Russia's de-ratification and the context more broadly where we're at. So if we zoom out to start with, then there are various pressures on the non-proliferation and disarmament architecture. There is no doubt. And it's not just about the Russian Federation's de-ratification. We see great concerns held by many states that nuclear weapons might again be used. This is something that was thought unthinkable, but there we are. We see concerns from many states about future testing by a state. We see concerns about the accumulation of highly enriched uranium for purposes that are difficult to explain. All of these things, cause there to be concern across the non-proliferation disarmament architecture. But then for the CTBT, as we focus more specifically and we look at the de-ratification by the Russian Federation, it is very disappointing, there is no doubt. It's deeply regrettable. That is also of no doubt. But in many ways, it is a symptom of the charged and unstable geopolitical landscape that we're in. The CTBT is not the only victim of these circumstances. We see a lack of consensus at NPT review conferences, the Russian Federation's suspension of New START, withdrawal from the CFE treaty, just to name a few. But I would say, and I say to all of you, that the CTBT remains a bright spot and remains a viable pathway forward for non-proliferation and disarmament. It is a bright spot for a number of reasons, and let me elaborate those reasons. Firstly, the treaty has got near universal support. On a good day, every country of the world will support the object and purpose of the CTBT. And that is a good thing. That is an empowering thing. There are only 9 countries in the whole planet that have not signed this treaty. 9. Soon there'll be less. And we see a powerful norm around the world, a norm against nuclear testing, a moratorium commitment by various states that is protecting all of humanity now against testing and the weapons that would develop. But why? Why is there such a powerful norm? Well, one significant contribution to that powerful norm is actually the international monitoring system established under the CTBT and the international data center that has been put in place. 90% complete, 305 facilities in place, 4 different technologies, data zooming in from 305 locations around the world into Vienna and then being shared back out to states in a transparent and near real-time way. And a system that we are confident can detect a nuclear explosion anywhere, anytime. Detected all of the DPRK tests, but will detect a nuclear explosion anywhere, anytime. That is giving confidence to states to commit to a moratorium on testing. And so this must be preserved. And this is of value to every state and to all humanity. We also see that there's significant momentum in support of this treaty. The Russian de-ratification is actually against the global tide. It is not with the global tide. We have 187 signatories, I don't like saying this, 177 ratifications, used to be 178. But the reality is that in the last 2 years, there was 8 new ratifications in the last 2 years, and 1 other country that has signed and is yet to ratify. I think by the end of next year, probably 5 more ratifications. Friends, this is the tide of humanity, is towards this treaty and towards its universalization. And absolutely, we need to see its entry into force. I want to touch on entry into force a little more in a moment, but I've just come back from a visit to China, and it was a very positive visit in terms of their commitment, to this treaty and the work that can be done, in establishing more of their stations as a part of the international monitoring system. We here in the CTBTO will continue to focus on the Annex II states that are yet to sign, to ratify, and to see this treaty enter into force. So the momentum is there, the coverage is there, the near universalization is there. So let me say a couple of things more specifically around the Russian Federation's de-ratification. I've been heartened that when I've had communications with senior Russian Federation officials in recent times is that they go to great lengths to continue to mention several things to me. They mentioned to me that we might be de-ratifying this treaty, but we are not unsigning it. We are not unsigning it. We are remaining committed to this treaty. We are not withdrawing. A second thing that they emphasize almost every time that I speak to them is that our moratorium commitment remains the same. And we will not test unless the United States of America tests first. The third thing that they emphasize is that their 32 stations of the international monitoring system, of which 31 are certified and are established and in place, they aim to complete their segment, all 32, before this year is out. And I've got to tell you, colleagues, that they're on track to do that. And the fourth and final thing that they stress is that they are committed to continuing to transmit data from their international monitoring system stations through to the international data center, and that data then to be shared with all states. So I'm sharing that with you. That's what the Russian Federation is saying to me. And that is the evidence of them remaining committed, although very regrettably, only as a signatory state and not as a ratifying state. We need to keep the perspective. One last thing I'd like to touch on before we can open for some questions is actually the issue of entry into force. And yes, it's sad that we now have 9 states in Annex 2 that need to ratify this treaty before it can enter into force. But due to a range of circumstances and questions about our testing and activities at testing or former testing sites, etc., there's never been a more important time to see entry into force of this treaty, because we actually need all of the elements, all 4 of the elements of the verification system to be available and active. And that will not happen prior to entry into force. It's wonderful that the IMS, one of those elements of the verification system, is working so well already, and the International Data Center, a part of that element, is working well. But the other elements, the element of consultation and clarification, so important to have that in place, to build confidence that states are abiding by their commitments. The element of confidence building measures, so there's no surprises, that states can have confidence in the total regime and its verification potential, and states abiding by their commitments. And in the ultimate test of on-site inspection. On-site inspection, which can tell us definitively, has there been a nuclear test or not? And now we've always thought that's really important to be able to prove that a nuclear test took place. But I think it's almost equally important to be able to prove a nuclear test didn't take place, because we need confidence in this global system, and we need all of the elements of the verification system to be in place to keep building that confidence. We cannot, as we see, take the CTBT and all of its global contribution of good for granted. But I say to you that where we are at the moment is we're heading towards a stronger and a stronger CTBT. Seeing the number of ratifying states drop from 178 to 177 is regrettable. Our response to that is going to be that within months, we will see back at 178, and then we will go to 179 and more. The best response we could have to that circumstance. Dear friends, this is not my treaty I'm talking about. This is actually our treaty. All of us, whether you're in government or in civil society, this is a treaty for all of humanity. This is a treaty for the good of us all, current generations and the generations to come, and we should do all we can to strengthen it. Daryl, thank you so much for the opportunity, and very happy to take questions and happy to join again later if there are any further questions for me.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Dr. Floyd, especially for the positive message on the treaty. We have a few questions here. I'm going to pose them to you, but if there are any further questions, folks, please put them in the Q&A function. So just to follow up on a couple of things you said, we have a couple questions. If you could please clarify your understanding about whether Russia's de-ratification has changed its legal obligations vis-a-vis the treaty. You said that they were continuing to deliver the data from their IMS stations, et cetera, but tell us about your understanding about the legal obligations and whether the withdrawal of ratification, which is very unusual, changes that.
Yeah. That's a very important point. I addressed the point they have not withdrawn from the treaty. They have de-ratified, but they still remain as a state signatory. The Vienna Convention on Treaties is very clear that when a state signs a treaty, then they commit to abide by the objects and purpose of that treaty at that point of signature. And so in the case of the Russian Federation, they remain a signatory, and therefore they remain committed and obliged, like any other state that has signed this treaty is committed and obliged to uphold the object and purpose of the treaty. So that element of obligation is unchanged. What the Russian Duma did is revoke their decision to extend the instrument of ratification to New York and to communicate that to the UN. And that they did a week or two back is followed through on that. They still have all of the obligations that they would have had prior to that act.
All right, thank you. And we have another question that goes to the issue of achieving entry into force of the treaty and your perspective on what some of the biggest obstacles are. And if I could just modify the question slightly, most people watching us here know that the treaty has an unusual entry into force clause where there were 44 named states and there are 8, now 9, that have not yet ratified that are necessary to achieve the full entry into force. As you look at this set of countries, are there a uniform set of problems that are the obstacles for ratification in those countries, or do we need to look at these case by case? And what is your personal diplomatic strategy for outreach to those remaining Annex II states? How would you describe that?
Daryl, you're correct. The Annex II to the treaty outlines 44 states, all of which must ratify the treaty for it to enter into force. It was believed that might take 3, 4, 5 years when the treaty was open for signature, and that would all happen. Sadly, we're in a situation where it hasn't happened. And one should ask the question, why? So with these 9 states, each of them I see is in their own geostrategic situation and context, and will make their decisions accordingly. Of the 9, it's so difficult to get used to these new numbers. Of the 9, 5 of them have signed. No, sorry, 6. I've got to add one now. 6 have signed and 3 have not signed. But they all need to ratify, for the treaty to enter into force. Our engagement is with each of them individually, working with them to see how we can get from the current context of where they are to a situation where they could ratify this treaty. I think that there are some that will need to move first before some others might follow. But I don't buy a simple domino, theory of if one state was to ratify, everybody else would. I don't buy that at all. But there certainly are some connected elements, in those 9 states that need to ratify. I think now we do have leadership required from the Russian Federation, China, and the United States of America. And if we saw leadership there, then I would hope that we could move through and see entry into force follow. We need to see this argument presented in the right way to the leadership and the decision-making areas of each of those countries. And I think we'll need to see them all act in unison at some point.
All right. Thank you. These are not surprisingly very comprehensive answers from the ES of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. Let me just ask you one more. There's some other questions in the Q&A that I think we're going to be covering in the next panel. But one that you're uniquely positioned to answer is, tell us a little bit about the progress related to the development of on-site inspection capabilities. The last integrated field exercise was in 2014. How is that progressing? Is there going to be more work in the future?
Thank you, Daryl. I couldn't have written a better question if I wrote it myself. The on-site inspection verification capability is one that we have a whole division that focuses on this. And the pinnacle of the testing and development process is what we call the integrated field exercises. The last of those was in 2014 and was hosted in Jordan. I'm very pleased to have announced recently that Sri Lanka will host the next integrated field exercise. That will take place in September, October of 2025. So we're sorry, no, it won't be. It'll be. We're having to work with some of the dates, but it will be 2025. So we're working towards that. There are a number of build-up exercises, tabletop exercises, work on equipment and lists of equipment and appropriate processes, that are being worked on in preparation for testing that in Sri Lanka in 2025.
Very good. Well, let's pause there. I want to thank you again, Dr. Floyd, for joining us. And he will be staying on and will be joining us for the Q&A section after the next panel, which is going to be led by Arms Control Association Senior Policy Analyst Shannon Bugos, who is right there. And she will take it over from here for the next panel. Thanks, Shannon.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Floyd and Daryl. And if the other panelists want to come on camera as well, that would be great. So thank you for joining us for today's event, everybody. We just had great framing opening remarks from Dr. Floyd, and now we have an excellent panel to further discuss the state of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and provide suggestions on where to go from here. So before we kick off the panel, I want to note one thing, that after the panelists offer remarks, we will turn to Q&A. As Daryl said, Dr. Floyd will come back on camera as well, and we'll take questions for all of our speakers today. So please continue to use the question and answer function on Zoom to submit your questions. And then I will be going through them and posing them to our speakers. And you can submit your questions at any time. So first up for this panel, we will welcome Elena Chernenko, who is a reporter and the head of the international division at the Moscow daily newspaper Kommersant. Based upon her extensive reporting and interviews, Elena will detail for us a few things, such as the factors fueling and the stated rationale behind the Russian government's decision to de-ratify the CTBT, Russia's concerns about the reported activities at the US former nuclear test site in Nevada, and what might be Putin's ultimate aims with all of these moves. After Elena will be Tony Jaquez, who is a counselor in the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Mexico was a co-sponsor of the resolution in support of the CTBT at the 78th UN General Assembly that took place this past September. Tony will be offering remarks about Mexico's perspective on Russia's de-ratification of the CTBT, as well as on the current international moratorium on nuclear testing and the importance of the Test Ban Treaty more generally. And Mexico is also a state party to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and I see some folks have submitted some questions already, that we'll pose to Tony about the intersection of these. The final speaker will be Daryl Kimball, who is the Executive Director of the Arms Control Association based in DC. And Daryl will provide suggestions on potential measures to address the concerns about activities at former nuclear test sites in China, Russia, and the United States that do not comply with the CTBT, and potential various steps that CTBT states parties can take to help strengthen the CTBT and the de facto global nuclear test moratorium. So thank you for your attention. And Elena, we will start off with you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Thank you very much, Daryl, for inviting me to this panel. I think Dr. Floyd's optimism was so bright that it was almost flowing over the screen. And let me continue with that optimistic note a little bit. I am Russian, but I have heard of an Irish saying that allegedly they quite often say when something unfortunate happens that it could be worse. So I think in this very situation, that applies very well. It could be worse. Why? Because we have seen in the recent months several options discussed within the Russian government, but also within the Russian expert communities in terms of several options in terms of nuclear signaling and showing more resolve in that sphere. One of the options discussed was, for example, the resumption of actual nuclear testing, because some experts here and some people in government believe that this would show the Russian resolve that is also technically needed. This would kind of bring back that feeling of fear during the Cold War and bring kind of people back to senses. So something like a nuclear test is needed to maybe kind of make states more eager to talk about compromise during the conflicts that we are facing now. Another option that was discussed was, for example, the toughening of the Russian nuclear doctrine, again, to make it more tough, because some of the hawkish experts here believe that it's the threshold set in that doctrine for nuclear use is too high. There is a very, very limited number of conditions and cases in which nuclear use is possible under the Russian nuclear doctrine. And there is experts and people in government that believe that this doctrine should be made more tough to encompass the current situation. And then a third option, there might be some more, but these are the options that were out in the public as well. The third option was de-ratifying the CTBT. Now, what is the rationale behind it? The rationale is, it was mentioned already by Daryl in the beginning, the symmetry between Russia and the US. So the Russian government believes that it is in its national security interest to be on par, symmetrically mirroring with the US in such matters when it comes to nuclear security. So the idea was when, for example, we were writing this in the summer and talking to people supporting this decision to de-ratify the treaty was, so the US Senate is not ratifying this treaty for more than 20 years because they believe it's in the disadvantage of the US national interest for various reasons. Russia has ratified the CTBT back in 2000. While the US is not even moving into that direction, and under the Trump administration, it has actually officially declared it won't move there. Now, the Biden administration changed that approach, but didn't really and doesn't really do anything to move towards a ratification. So why should Russia then keep its ratification in force if its main opponent right now, the US, sees disadvantages to its national security from having the treaty ratified. So in mirroring the US actions and having total symmetry, the Russia would then need to de-ratify the treaty. But out of these three things that I have mentioned, so first, resume nuclear testing, second, toughen the nuclear doctrine, and third, de-ratify the CTBT treaty, I would say that, well, the third one is, my personal characterization of this is the vegetarian option for reasons that Dr. Floyd has laid out already. And you can see how this decision-making, I mean, those most important decisions in Russia, of course, are taken by the president. And he has talked about these very options at the Valdai meeting on the 5th of October. He was asked about the toughening of the nuclear doctrine, and he clearly said that he does not see the need for this right now. When talking about resuming testing, he said that there is Russian technical experts that argue for the need to resume testing. And he also mentioned concerns about the US probably moving into that direction, resuming testing, suspicious activities at the Nevada test site. But he was kind of undecided over this. He didn't say yes, this could be happening, or no, this would be not happening. Previously, the Russian government officials were saying that only if the US resume testing, Russia will do the same. But then when talking about the CTBT, he said, de-ratifying this will be enough. So out of these options, this was chosen as, like, I would say the smallest, the vegetarian step. It could be worse because the other options are clear and more tough. So in practical terms, and I think Dr. Floyd has laid out this already, the signature is not being revoked. The Russian officials insist on this every time. The moratorium is keeping in place until the US does not test first. The stations that are part of the international monitoring systems in Russia stay in place, continue working. And as Dr. Floyd said, 32nd station will be added soon to that system, and that data continues flowing. And as we can see also from the statements, cooperation with the preparatory committee of the treaty is continuing just as it did before. Now, interestingly, there was, and I'm ending with this, there was quite recently, just a few days ago, a Russian-wide poll of citizens being asked what they think about the de-ratification of the treaty. And I was surprised to see the results, because I would have expected less people to know what the CTBT is about. It isn't a treaty that has been really discussed very much before very recently, but 56% of the people polled say that they support de-ratification, exactly for the reasons that I have talked about earlier, to be on par with the US that has not ratified the treaty. 23% are against de-ratifying it because they fear this might lead to more confrontation, maybe bring back nuclear testing and raise risks in the nuclear sphere. And 21% honestly said that they don't know. But overall, when they were asked what they think about nuclear testing and the abolition of nuclear weapons, almost 60% of the people asked say that they would support the continuation of the nuclear moratorium and also even the abolition of nuclear weapons. So we see that the public opinion here is, it's not unified. There is quite different opinions, but overall it's not like hawkish or something. And as I said, I think it could be worse.
Thank you very much, Elena, and for offering those figures and giving us a lot to think about. So Tony, we are going to turn next to you to give us Mexico's perspective on the current events revolving around the CTBT.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you to the Arms Control Association for this event, but also for including the view of a country like mine from the Global South. Of course, I'm not intending to portray the position of all the countries of the Global South. There are a lot of nuances, but I want to say that first and foremost, from the point of view of Mexico, the CTBT has been, as Dr. Floyd said, a beacon of hope in the in the disarmament and non-proliferation regime. Mexico has been attached to the treaty from its negotiations. Ambassador Miguel Marín Bosch, who has already passed away, was leading part of the negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament, and Mexico was one of the countries, along with New Zealand and Australia, that have put forward the resolution on from the very beginning, from Resolution 50 to 245 in 1996 of the adoption of the treaty. And year by year, the support of the General Assembly is led by our three countries. So I wanted to mention that because the General Assembly demonstrates that most of the members of the United Nations support the treaty, its entry into force, and its objectives. This past year, the resolution got 176 votes in favor. This is something that doesn't sound like very major, but in the context of the first committee, it's a high number in votes in favor. Most of the resolutions in the first committee are not consensual and get less than that amount of voting. This is a resolution that is well accepted, but it is not because of the resolution, but because it talks about the treaty and about why the treaty was negotiated. And I want to dwell a little bit on that. We have heard that the treaty has been effective in even if it hasn't entered into force, in demonstrating that testing should be banned, and there should be the ban should be based on a very effective verification and monitoring system. And I think that these concepts are very important, more important than ever. One of the reasons why the testing was banned was, of course, to curtail the spread of nuclear weapons, the so-called horizontal proliferation, also the vertical proliferation, which is the modernization of nuclear weapons. But at the end of the day, the treaty prevents the consequences of testing and the legacy of testing that we have been seeing in different parts of the world is something that we need to keep in mind. And I wanted to emphasize that because from the point of view of the countries on my side of the world, the concern is about prevention of the consequences of more testing for the environment, for the ecosystem, for the communities, for the human beings. Putting human beings at the center of every single public policy should be the aim of the members of the United Nations at this time and age. The other priority that we think that we should set for ourselves in public policy is to uphold previous agreements and obligations. And the position in which we are now, because of what has happened and the decision of the Russian Federation, which is not the only reason, because as we heard Dr. Floyd said, the international architecture of disarmament and non-proliferation treaties have been erosioned already very heavily by several decisions, not only by this country, but by other countries, and also by the many voices that keep being heard in media and in the international multilateral community, advocating for keeping nuclear weapons and for using nuclear weapons for national security purposes. And this erosion contrasts heavily with the amount of countries, which is a majority of countries, that do not adhere to having nuclear weapons as a security basis. And most of these countries, all the non-nuclear weapon states that are parties to the NPT, and of those 116 which are parties to the nuclear weapon free zones treaties, and then 69 of those that have of non-nuclear weapon states that have already ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So this is the numeralia of countries that do not adhere to nuclear weapons for their security preservation, and also who reject nuclear weapons and thus reject testing. And these are the ones that are going to be upholding the norm against testing. more than other countries that keep advocating for the use of nuclear weapons. So we need to continue upholding previous agreements and obligations. As I said, our side of the world have to keep on fulfilling our obligations, these obligations laid out in these treaties, not only in the CTBT, as I said, but also in the NPT and in the other treaties. I always say that the difference between our countries and the other countries is beyond the CTBT or the non-proliferation architecture. It has to do with the fact that if Mexico doesn't fulfill its obligations with the CTBT, NPT, the nuclear weapon-free zones, the comprehensive safeguards agreement, etc., then we will be imposed sanctions by the Security Council, or we are going to be sent to the Security Council for sanctions. And there are other countries that will never go there. Will never be scrutinized in that way. And that is the difference. But this is a fact of how the multilateral regime that we are living in was established because of how the UN was founded. And this is, but this is an issue that we need to take into consideration, that the obligations and commitments of the non-nuclear weapon states are being fulfilled with very few exceptions, and are being monitored and registered and supervised and verified at large. Mexico and New Zealand and Australia expressed their opinion on the recent decision by the Russian Federation at the General Assembly. At that time, when we were presenting the resolution, we expressed our concern about that issue, and the important thing of the position that we expressed was that the Russian Federation should keep demonstrating commitment to maintaining and strengthening the international norm against nuclear weapon testing, and that I wanted to emphasize that is not only an obligation of the Russian Federation, but of all signatories. I wanted to complement what Dr. Floyd said by reminding the audience that Russia and all the signatories of the CTBT, including Mexico, and also all the other ones that have not ratified and are part of Annex 2, are bound by resolution CTBT MSS Res 1 of November 1996 that says that all the signatories have to take, are obliged to take all necessary measures to ensure the rapid and effective establishment of the future comprehensive nuclear test ban organization, including through financial support and engagement with the preparatory commission's work to establish the verification system. So the fact that Russia keeps its obligations on that resolution is crucial, but that goes for all the signatories as well. So this is our part of our concern, that there is this feeling that because this is happening on one side of the world, the rest of the signatories might feel that their obligations are, weakened, or that we have a free pass not to continue fulfilling our obligations. So that's why I emphasize this issue so much. Then the other issue that we need to continue doing from the point of view of the signatories of the CTBT is to raise our voice at the proper venues. We need to maybe work this issue in the CTBTO Working Group B, and also in the conference of the Article 14. We have time. We have 2 years to talk about the consequences of these recent developments, but also to move forward on how to establish new levels of political signaling, but also to raise the political cost of further weakening of the treaty. And we have the Article 14 conferences every 2 years, which, in my view, have been a little bit misused or not used or profited from in a constructive way as a consultation forum to establish what the signatories of the CTBT should be doing, which is moving forward on strengthening the norm, but also raising the political cost to those that have not ratified yet, and calling on those countries to accelerate the process of ratification. And this was also a commitment established under the NPT obligations and commitments, especially in the review conference in 2010. My final comment would be also to recognize that as Dr. Floyd already said, the instability in the political environment nowadays is taking a toll not only on the CTBT. The CTBTO is not the only forum, or not the only venue that is receiving the impact of the instability. And we need to also remind ourselves that the CTBT, for example, was sent to the General Assembly for a vote because the Conference on Disarmament already in 1996 could not agree on its adoption. And the paralysis in the Conference on Disarmament is something that is often taken for granted, and we see this as a sign of the health and the status of the disarmament machinery that we need to look into. But the most important consideration regarding this very gloomy scenario regarding the disarmament machinery is to remind ourselves that the international fora were created to give a space for countries to give to explore global options or global solutions for global problems. So it is a fallacy, in my view, to think that the international environment has to be optimal for the organizations to reach agreements. That is a very easy way out of the obligations that we have at states to forge more dialogue, to establish more channels of diplomatic dialogue, which is our work, at least in the multilateral disarmament diplomacy. It's our work to keep the dialogue open, to keep establishing standards, high standards, so that we can raise the political cost and pressure on fulfilling what we have already agreed on. So while I understand that the situation in the juncture that we're in, it's very complicated, I don't subscribe to the fact that this is something that we need to accept as a reason or a rationale for the international forum not to work. We think that this is the reason why the fora must work, and we need to use the venues effectively and consistently. And I think that all countries need to take that responsibility as a very serious job for the future. We have good opportunities, as I said before. In the CTBT case, we have the Article 14 conference, but also we have other opportunities in order to continue exercising our power as members of the United Nations, but also as the majority of countries that have refused testing as a base for developing more nuclear weapons or for modernizing more nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. And before we go to our last speaker, just a reminder that after Daryl, we will turn to Q&A. So we've gotten a bunch of great questions already. Continue to keep those coming in. And Daryl, your turn. Tell us how to fix everything.
Well, let me start maybe by just reinforcing what our previous speakers were saying about the value of the CTBT and why it's important to uphold the CTB regime in these difficult global times. And I want to just underscore that even though the treaty has not entered into force yet, and many of us have been working for that end, the CTBT is still one of, if not the most successful and valuable agreements in the long history of nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, and disarmament. No country today is conducting nuclear test explosions, and North Korea is the only country in this century that has done so. And so from a disarmament standpoint, from a stability standpoint, why is that important? It's mainly because without the option to conduct nuclear tests, it's more difficult, though not impossible, to develop, prove, and field new warhead designs. So the CTB has been and continues to be an immensely stabilizing force that puts the brakes on global arms racing. It's not the only solution, but it's an essential part. But as I said at the opening, and as I think we all realize, we can't take the treaty for granted. Tony just provided an excellent overview of the reasons why this is important from the perspective of the majority of the CTBT states parties. And we need to keep working towards entry into force. But we at the Arms Control Association have really welcomed the Biden administration's reaffirmation of the United States' strong support for the CTBT. But it is clear that the United States Senate is not in a state yet where it is ready to take on the issues of this treaty, which has not been looked at by the Senate since 1999. And the Biden administration has, for I think various reasons, not put in the necessary energy to put together an education campaign to build the necessary support to achieve the 67 votes necessary for Senate advice and consent. And of course, amongst the other Annex II states, there has been no serious consideration of signature and ratification for many years. So the reality is that the treaty's entry into force is still years off. And meanwhile, we've got to manage the challenges that it is facing. And I want to zero in on one of them that bears particular attention, and that is related to Russia's de-ratification and some of the statements that Russia has made and the statements the US has made about one another's nuclear testing policies. As we all know, the possessors of the largest nuclear arsenals are engaged in massive, expensive nuclear modernization programs. Some are pursuing new nuclear weapons delivery systems, and some, like China, are increasing the size and diversity of their arsenals. And as we know, each of the three major nuclear armed states, the US, China, and Russia, all continue to engage in weapons-related activities at their former test sites. This includes chemical high explosions for different purposes and subcritical nuclear experiments at these sites underground and in containment vessels. And so although the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty's international monitoring system is fully operational, it's working 24/7 and working far more effectively than many had originally envisioned back in the 90s when it was designed. Low yield, very low yield nuclear test explosions can still be difficult to detect without on-site monitoring, which we don't have because the treaty has not entered into force. So we have, I think, a situation that we need to address, a situation that could, over the next several years, lead to charges and countercharges that could provide a justification for one or another state to resume full-blown nuclear explosive testing. And I would just note that since 2018, the United States has actually formally alleged that Russia at some point in time has engaged in activities inconsistent with the Zero-Yield Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The State Department compliance report charged, quote, that during the 1995-2018 timeframe, Russia probably conducted nuclear weapons-related tests, unquote, at the former test site in Novaya Zemlya. Now, that assessment doesn't provide any evidence about the charge. It does not claim that the Russian activities were militarily significant. Up until 2016, the United States had not been making such a charge. So Russia, of course, has vigorously denied these charges and repeatedly pointed to the United States' failure to ratify the treaty. And when Russia withdrew ratification from the CTBT last month, we also heard President Putin and others, or I should say not President Putin, but it was the foreign ministry, suggest that the United States might be engaged in activities at the test sites that are preparations to resume nuclear testing. And in fact, as all this was happening, the National Nuclear Security Administration conducted a chemical high explosive verification test at one of the underground tunnels at the Nevada National Security Site, the former test site. And Russian officials said that they were investigating whether this was actually a chemical high explosive test. So I mention all of this to point out that there is a serious need to explore the development of voluntary confidence building measures designed to detect and deter possible low-level clandestine nuclear testing before the entry into force of the treaty. And this is an idea that many NGOs and the Arms Control Association have been talking about for many years, going back, I recall, to 2001. So it was very positive for many of us to hear in June, National Nuclear Security Administrator Jill Ruby announced that her agency is, quote, open to working with others to develop a regime that will allow reciprocal observation with radiation detection equipment at each other's subcritical experiments to allow confirmation that the experiment was consistent with the CTBT, unquote. So this is an idea that has begun to circulate. We've been hearing more about it. Dr. Ruby elaborated a bit on the concept in an interview with Arms Control Today that we just published earlier this week. But to date, the U.S. transparency concept has not been transmitted in a formal written form to other governments, in particular, not yet to the Russian or Chinese governments. And they have not accepted or rejected the offer, therefore, because they've not yet gotten the offer. I would also note that there's an article in the current issue of Arms Control Today, the November issue, by 3 physicists that elaborates on some of these methods that could be used that Dr. Ruby discussed. And they write that there are technical methods to determine the amount of fission energy released by a contained, very low yield test months or years later by measuring with instrumentation the gamma rays from the radioactive decay of fission products and from the transmutation products produced by the experiment. And because the yields of the supercritical experiments, those that are prohibited by the treaty, are orders of magnitude larger than those of subcritical experiments, it is possible to detect violations of the zero yield prohibition on nuclear testing. All that means that with further technical discussions between these former nuclear testing states, there may be some solutions that can be developed to provide each of them with the confidence that they can detect and deter the others from conducting activities at the test sites that have military purposes that violate the CTBT. I mean, this is in the mutual interest of Russia, China, and the United States. It could be carried out through bilateral arrangements. I would say ideally overseen and verified by an independent technical set of experts from the CTBTO to create greater confidence about what is and is not happening at these test sites so long as they remain around. That dialogue could be pursued on a bilateral basis, perhaps through the bilateral US-China channel on arms control that we just heard yesterday will continue, or through the P5 process, which is the nuclear policy-related dialogue between the 5 nuclear armed members of the NPT. So I think this is an important new area for CTB states parties to look at. It's an issue, and I'm reinforcing something that Tony Jacques has said. It's an issue not just for the states that were conducting nuclear test explosions before, but for all CTB states parties, because it's in everyone's interest and responsibility to ensure that the treaty is being complied with. And then finally, I would just note that there are other ways, and Tony outlined some of these already, to reinforce the CTBT as we go forward. At the CTB Article 14 conference every 2 years, at the UNGA, as Mexico and others have recently done, but also at the UN Security Council. And one specific idea I would just raise again is the possibility that the UN Security Council members in the near future could agree on a resolution stating their commitment to the CTBT, its entry into force, as well as to encourage their permanent members, the P5, to engage in technical talks on these confidence building measures at the test sites. There was a very good and strong resolution in 2016, Resolution 2310, that was adopted by the Security Council. That model might be pursued once again in the coming year, especially in the wake of Russia's de-ratification and these charges and countercharges about violations, possible violations at the test site. So let me stop there. Thank you, everyone, and I'll turn it back over to Shannon.
Great, thank you, Daryl. And now we'll begin the Q&A portion. Dr. Floyd, if you want to come back on screen, we've gotten additional questions for you. And given how near the end of Daryl's remarks, he referenced NNSA Administrator Ruby's proposal. So follow-up questions for you on that. Have there been any responses in addition to Russia to Jill Ruby's offer for talks on confidence building measures at former test sites? She had noted in the interview with Arms Control today that you had been at the Nevada site recently, and perhaps were the last international visitor. So it seems like you would have very great insight into kind of more of the happenings.
Thank you, Shannon, for the question. Obviously, the question should be directed to the US Department of Energy to see what responses they've had. Yes, I absolutely have been to the Nevada National Security Site. I was hosted there by the Department of Energy recently, and I greatly appreciate that. I would love to be able to visit the test sites of other countries as well. That would be a great opportunity. But the take up on the offer that Dr. Ruby made, I'm not aware of the specific responses, but a question that should be directed to NNSA.
Great, thank you. Elena, we have a question for you that is going to be more big picture, so prepare yourself. But we've had a few folks asking if you believe that the architecture of disarmament and non-proliferation is dismantling. I'm putting this question to you in particular, given your reporting on US-Russian arms control as well. And so hopefully we can have that more big picture answer to this very broad question that you can now take in any direction.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Yes, absolutely. The architecture of arms control and non-proliferation is dismantling in the recent years. As you rightly said, I do cover these topics, and I have the feeling that in the last years, all I do is bury the one or the other treaty that used to exist. But I would not go as far as to blame Russia for this, because we have seen other states involved into this architecture do steps to dismantle it as well. Let's say the US was the first to go and leave the INF Treaty. It was the US that left the Open Skies Treaty. It was the US that went out of the agreement on the nuclear deal with Iran. So there is many steps that states have been taken to dismantle this architecture, unfortunately. And right now there is not much of it left.
Thank you, Elena. And I think we'll come back around in the second round of questions for you about kind of unfortunately going down that more pessimistic path of things don't look great right now. And you had mentioned that the de-ratification of CTBT is the vegetarian option, right? It could get worse. So we'll tackle that question and that idea a little bit farther down. But I do want to turn to Tony next, because we've had questions come in about kind of the role of the TPNW. And so in your remarks, you had talked about the need for people to be vocal, right? Exercise opportunities. We have the second meeting of the TPNW states parties coming up in just a few weeks at the end of November. And so a question came in about what role can the TPNW play to promote or advance the goals of the CTBT, or is there a more effective way to go about it?
Thank you for the question. If I may, I would like also to answer the question put forward to Elena and say that the architecture, the disarmament and non-proliferation treaty architecture has been dismantled, but on the bilateral side, not on the multilateral side. I think that the multilateral regime, even if it has had a lot of setbacks in the past years because of the lack of I don't say political will, because that's also one of the narratives that it's not really true. It's lack of political dialogue and diplomatic dialogue and instances to do real diplomacy, not negotiating programs of work, for example, at NAUSEMAS in the Conference on Disarmament, but really actually facts-based discussion and giving and taking about further measures, both confidence building, implementing measures, and also looking forward measures. We don't have that, as in the past, we don't have a lot of venues to talk amongst both the nuclear weapon states and also the nuclear weapon states vis-a-vis the non-nuclear weapon states. So I want to say that we still have that architecture in place, and we should use it more effectively and use it also to not only to put pressure, but as I said, to demonstrate that the majority of the countries of the world are fulfilling our obligations and commitments. The TPNW establishes also a prohibition on testing. And there is a working group of the architecture of the TPNW that was established last year that informally is working on the complementarity of the treaty with other treaties, especially the NPT, that is the cornerstone of the regime, but also the CTBT and other treaties, like the nuclear weapon free zone treaties that also establish legally binding prohibitions on testing for the countries establishing nuclear weapons free zones. So we should not forget about those provisions that are, some of them precede the CTBT and even the NPT in the case of the Latin American and Caribbean region. So what I am saying is that the countries that have decided to prohibit nuclear weapons in our national legislations, either regionally or globally, now with the TPNW, have established a very steadfast prohibition on testing, on nuclear testing, and have taken national legislation steps to uphold that prohibition. And the complementarity with other regimes is a very important issue for the TPNW parties. At the second meeting of states parties, this is going to be, of course, brought about by countries in their national statements and the national implementation review. The meeting of states parties is an opportunity to review how well the treaty parties are implementing their obligations and commitments under the treaty. It is not a meeting to reinvent provisions every single year, and we had a meeting last year, a very successful first meeting of states parties in Vienna with an action plan that talks about the complementarity between treaties, but also as I said before, the obligations in the treaty that have to be upheld by the parties, and one of them is testing. We hope that many non-parties of the TPNW come to observe. We have already received several requests. 20 countries are going to be participating as observers. And I say this because this is going to reinforce the idea that this treaty is complementary to others, but also that we need to open, not close, the avenues for dialogue and for more confidence building measures between regimes and between states.
Thank you, Tony. I have a question for you, Daryl, and then we'll come back to Elena, and then I'm going to start pairing up some of you for some of the other questions that have rolled in. But first, to Daryl, we had two different questions come in about the United States and the CTBT. In your remarks, you had talked about how Congress hasn't looked at the treaty since 1999. Entry into force is still years off. But some of the questions we got were what are the main objections of Republican senators towards CTBT, and are there ways to persuade the U.S. Senate to eventually ratify the CTBT? So if you can take those highly politicized questions, we look forward to your answer.
Sure. So I had the fortunate or unfortunate experience of leading an NGO coalition to try to help achieve ratification of the treaty in 1999. We were not successful. The reasons then are probably the reasons that might be cited by senators who were skeptical or opposed to the CTBT, because there hasn't been much discussion or evaluation of what's changed since 1999. So these old arguments, I think, would be the default positions that a presidential administration, a non-governmental coalition, senators who want to ratify the treaty would have to take on. And they come down to kind of three main areas. One argument back then, which I think we would probably hear again, simply because it was there, and is that the United States cannot do without nuclear testing to maintain our existing arsenal, to maintain a robust nuclear deterrent. That argument, I think, has been dealt with very well, simply through the record of the Stockpile Stewardship Program, which is too expensive. It is misdirected in some areas, but it is being very effective in maintaining the reliability of the existing warheads in the U.S. arsenal. So it's pretty clear now. I think there's a technical consensus, a growing political consensus, that nuclear testing is not necessary to maintain the U.S. arsenal anymore. The other argument was that other countries are going to or could cheat on the treaty. They could do so without detection. And because the United States meets its treaty obligations, the argument went, we will be abiding by the treaty while others don't. The reality, however, is that the CTBT, International Monitoring System, is no longer a theory as it was in 1999. It exists. It's been working in practice. It's proven itself. The capabilities are better than ever before. And eventually, if we have entry into force, we'll have on-site inspections, which provide an even stronger deterrent against testing. And then the other argument, which was rather, I think, bizarre, is that U.S. ratification won't bring other countries into the treaty regime, the other Annex II states, and therefore, what is the point of doing this? Why restrict ourselves? Why leave off this option? I think the answer to that today is self-evident. I mean, U.S. leadership is not necessarily going to be decisive, but it is essential to get other countries to join the treaty. So, I mean, these are issues and arguments that have not been visited in more than 20 years. No U.S. administration yet since 1999, even the Barack Obama administration, has committed the time, effort, energy it would take to do the months-long, if not years-long, campaign to build support. I don't see that happening in the near future, unfortunately, although I would wish that the Biden administration could. I think it also, in reality, requires a Senate that is less fractious and has a greater number of Democrats who are historically more supportive of the CTBT. So that is where we are, and we need to continue to look for the opportunities to move this forward here in the United States.
Thank you, Daryl. Elena, I have a question for you, and then I'm going to have a question for Daryl and Dr. Floyd. But Elena, I had hinted about this before, about coming back around to, you had said de-ratification of the treaty being the vegetarian option. It could have been worse. So in your view, will it get worse? How so? And on the flip side, for us optimists out there, are there kind of points of hope that you're like, okay, there might actually be changes that would be conducive to arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation?
Thank you very much, Shannon. With the de-ratification being the vegetarian option, I meant mostly what Dr. Floyd was extensively talking about, the Russian commitment to the practical cooperation within the treaty, so that the stations are working, the data is flowing, the moratorium is being upheld, the signature is in place, and the cooperation with the preparatory committee. So it's more a symbolic step than the other options that would have, I think, more practical negative influences for the global arms control regime. Could it get worse? I think it could. I guess it always can, and we see every time that it does get worse. With worse, I would think the real resumption of nuclear testing. Well, the Russian officials have said on different levels that only if the US go first, Russia would do the same. But in the current situation of mistrust, very deep mistrust, and suspicions between the states of the other maybe already being on the verge of starting of testing, we might face something of a situation where one of the other states does think that the other is almost about to test and then go head first, or something of a crisis situation. And I hope that doesn't happen. Those confidence building measures that have been here discussed during the panel before, well, Russia has not responded yet to them officially, because as Daryl was saying correctly, as far as I understand as well, there is no official offer on the table, and we will see how this develops, if there is one, to Russia and China and other states. But in terms of positive steps and a glimpse of hope, I don't see a possibility right now to give a clear answer to that, because the situation is so unpredictable right now, with conflicts arising out of nothing almost, or that nobody had predicted really, and the situation in arms control being so sad right now. But it still can get worse. We will see. Well, we have the New START treaty expiring in, well, it's almost just 2 years from now in 26. There will be not much left after that. We will see whether Russia and the US are able to come up with other measures instead of that treaty, a framework of, I don't know, bilateral agreements or unilateral voluntary steps or something else. Maybe not only in the bilateral format, but I have quite bigger hopes to the multilateral format, to the P5 that are having regular discussions, even now, despite of the confrontation going around. So we will see. I mean, sometimes it helps to be an optimist in the current situation.
Thank you, Elena. Next, Daryl and Dr. Floyd. So we had an attendee submit 2 questions, and I think one is more technical in nature. So for Dr. Floyd, if a major nuclear power such as Russia and the United States want to carry out nuclear tests, would they be deterred from fear of being caught by the international monitoring system? And then Daryl, more of a political or policy question, but related, is while the non-testing norm is strong, do you think it might be broken due to the continued rise of nuclear rhetoric and international tensions? Dr. Floyd, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Would a state be deterred because they could be shown to have tested? That really is a question for the political calculus of a state. What I can tell you is that with absolute confidence that a nuclear weapon test anywhere would be detected. So that states, if they wish to test a new weapon, if somebody's developing a weapon or test a new weapon, it will be detected. They will be detected. They need to go ahead in that knowledge. Just to emphasize this point is that when the international monitoring system was first being designed, the notion was to establish a system which could detect any nuclear explosion of the yield of 1 kiloton, 1,000 tons of TNT equivalent, anywhere on the face of the planet. That system is already in place. In fact, we're very confident that we're probably down well below that, say at around 0.5 kiloton. So, for relativity, I know we've got a lot of experts on this call, but for those that aren't, for relativity, then we're talking 16 kilotons for the Hiroshima, device that was dropped. Now we're saying we can detect anywhere something down to 0.5 kiloton. But we need to go beyond the international monitoring system to the other elements of the verification regime to have even greater confidence that any test anywhere would be detected, could be characterized, and the confidence can then be given to all of the states of the world. It's a political question as to whether being shown for what you have done would deter a state to test. But it's very clear that since the 1996 opening for signature of the CTBT through to now, less than a dozen tests have taken place, most of them by one state. So I think there's good evidence that there is a deterrence effect, and I appreciate the good judgment of the states of the world, to commit to a moratorium and not test.
Thanks, Daryl.
Thanks, Shannon. That was very well said, Dr. Floyd. And so on the political side of the equation, and let me just address the issue here in the United States. The United States last conducted a nuclear test explosion in September of 1992. The US Congress has shown a great deal of support for the non-testing policy of the United States, even though it has, the Senate has not been smart enough to support ratification of the CTBT. And I would just note that for any future US president who wants to consider resuming nuclear testing for whatever reason, there would be enormous political resistance from a large segment of the Congress, which would have the power to deny funding for that activity. There would be an enormous debate about the technical need to break this norm after more than a quarter of a century. And one piece of evidence for this is, if you recall, in 2020, it was reported in the Washington Post that senior Trump administration officials had floated the idea of conducting a nuclear test explosion in the United States in order to essentially intimidate Russia and China. Same kind of logic that Elena was describing that some Russian experts today think should be applied to the current situation, but in reverse. That report led members of the House and the Senate to introduce legislation, which was adopted, to bar any use of funds for nuclear testing. That was for 1 year, and that was approved, and that was part of the defense authorization bill. So I think that's a recent example of how the Congress would reply and respond. I think the barriers for ratifying the CTBT right now in the United States are high, but the barriers for resuming nuclear testing are even higher.
Thank you, Daryl. And Tony, I saw your hand, and I want to pose one other question to you that we got, so you can answer that when you respond to what Daryl and Dr. Floyd had talked about. But the question we got from an attendee is, what could the NPT PrepCom say or do to reinforce confidence that state signatories are taking all necessary measures to support the CTBTO? Are there any tasks or activities that you think would help? So if you could answer that as well, that would be great. And then we'll end on a question for everybody. But for now, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I wanted to jump in about this idea of the deterrent and the game changer that the CTBT was. That implied that no nuclear weapon tests, explosive nuclear weapon tests, could be really carried out in secret anymore. And the existence of the monitoring system has eliminated that possibility in most of the cases, and also has withdrawn the political power that entailed in the past. And then the nuclear weapon states, the signatories of the NPT, the so-called P5, because I don't want to call them P5 in this context, because I don't want to attach any relation between possessing nuclear weapons and the permanency in the Security Council. But they have been upholding a moral stand on the fact that they have signed the NPT and that they are fulfilling their obligations. They claim that they are in compliance with the NPT, because there are no clear or explicit obligations for them as there are for the non-nuclear weapon states. Okay, so this is the NPT part. But when they talk about preserving the norm of the CTBT, they do it also from that a moral stand of not having tested in the 20th century. For example, they say there's only one country that has tested in the 21st century. So I think that the stigmatization of testing that the CTBT has provided is something that we need to take very, very seriously, because it has actually changed the dynamics of rhetoric for the nuclear weapon states. And it would be very difficult to move past, if they actually started testing again, it would be very difficult for them to hold on to this stand in the negotiations with other countries that are testing, or that other countries that are in lack of compliance of other treaties. Coming to the NPT, we need to remind ourselves that it is no coincidence that the first systematic step adopted by all the parties of the NPT in 2000 to comply with the disarmament part of the NPT, the so-called 13 steps. The first step was the entry into force of the CTBT. And this is a core element of what we mean by obligations and commitments of all the parties of the NPT. So in the review conferences, what we mean by that, when we say we want to attain and maintain a nuclear weapon-free world, is to fulfill what we have already agreed, and one of the issues is the entry into force of the CTBT. So this is a core issue to which we are adhering over and over again in the NPT, even if there are no consensus outcomes. And the next time that we have a review conference in 2026, it will be 16 years of the last time that we had an outcome agreed by consensus. But anyway, the previous agreements are current, are valid for the NPT parties, and we have already taken a lot of time into phrasing how to move forward on the CTBT question. And in the action plan on the 2010, there was a definite signal or a definite call for the nuclear weapon states to lead these efforts. So as Dr. Floyd said, it will require the leadership of the nuclear weapon states, not because they are more important than the other parties of the NPT, but because if they are really wanting to uphold this regime that has been beneficial for them, because it has reduced the security concerns that they had in the 60s. So it has been mostly beneficial for them. If they want to uphold the NPT regime, they will need to move forward on continuing implementing the steps that we agreed in 2000 and in 2010.
Great, thank you, Tony. So we are already 1 minute over, so we'll just do a quick round. I have a question from one more attendee that you are our speakers are all welcome to weigh in on or offer a last thought as we close things out. So please keep any answers, last thoughts brief. But the question we got from an attendee that I think is particularly relevant here, given all of those in the audience, is what can civilians do to help the dismantling of the arms control architecture? Or you can tackle that question or offer another final thought. But let's start in the order that we had our speakers today with Dr. Floyd.
Thank you. In some ways, I addressed the importance of the role of civil society in my opening comments. This really is a team effort. You know, I look to Tony and I know what she has done. She's done amazing things as a diplomat for her country and representing the causes of many other countries. But there's only, so as good as Tony is, there's only so much that she can do. For me, heading an international organization with such an amazing, noble cause of seeking to see a world without nuclear tests and without the weapons that they produce is an honor and a privilege, and I put my full effort into this. But whether it's Tony as a government official or whether it's me as an international civil servant, we are buoyed up by the strength of the opinion of civil society, of the public, that voices do matter, voices do count, and political systems in each country do listen to these issues. I want to hear the voices of the young people that have an aspiration for what the world should look like. Then voices do count. You said short, didn't you? I'm sorry, I get too excited about this, but thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Elena?
Thank you very much. I can talk about the role of the media as I see it. I think it is very important for journalists to cover those issues, to clarify questions that might come up, to explain what is at stake, and to give all parties a possibility to explain their point of view. So this is, I think, the most important thing that we can add to global stability and security. And Shannon, you also said that we could maybe add something very, very shortly. I thought a very interesting comment in the Q&A section by a prominent Russian expert, Vladimir Putin, on several more reasons that he thinks were behind the Russian decision to de-ratify the treaty. I would respectfully disagree in a part, because I don't think that those points listed were the reasons for Russia to actually de-ratify the treaty. But I would absolutely agree that they are the background of this decision being taken. They are the background of those options that I was earlier talking about being discussed, so that the situation with the confrontation between the West and Russia and the West is at such a low point that we are actually discussing such steps. So I would not say they are the reasons, but they are definitely the backstage of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Tony?
Yeah, on the civil society role, I just want to emphasize from the point of view of a government official, is that the civil society has two very important contributions to our work. One, of course, is especially academia, to provide with technical input to avoid disinformation, stimulate a facts-based discussion on the issues, not on political ideology. And that is a very important contribution that the international organizations and academia and also the media do. But the other one is to hold governments accountable. And not only the nuclear weapon states in this case, or the ones that we are talking about, but all governments should be held accountable by civil society. We need to continue delivering on what we have agreed at, and what the United Nations means for the young people and for the societies has to be concrete, has to demonstrate that we have had discussions that are meaningful and in line with our public policies. And I think that is something that the civil society can do very effectively and should continue advocating for the just causes of humanity. one last quote is from a Mexican diplomat who won the Nobel Peace Prize, Alfonso Garcia Robles, who said that a drop of water on a rock seems like nothing. But if that drop of water keeps falling in the same place, maybe it will break the rock. And maybe our voices, even if they are small, and if they fall in the same place over and over and over again, can cut the rock. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And then Daryl, final comment, and then we'll close out.
Well, thanks everybody on behalf of ACA. I think that question about what the individual can do is a great one to end on. And I would just say it is to stay informed, it is to stay engaged, and to find a way to work with others in your community, your state, your country, to hold, as Tony just said, your government officials, elected reps accountable, and more specifically to demand that they support or take action to pursue effective diplomacy between nuclear armed adversaries on arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament, to reduce the role and the number of nuclear weapons, to maintain the ban on nuclear testing. It is, through history, it has been that kind of pressure for that kind of engagement between governments that has produced results like the CTBT. So we need to try to redouble that, and it's up to everyone in many countries to get across the finish line. Thanks, Shannon.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for your remarks today and for staying a little bit extra so we could tackle that final question. And thanks to all of the attendees. We hope this was helpful and informative. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thank you again.